I'm Mette Thyssen, the International Director at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and I do have a few housekeeping points before my welcoming remarks. I'll ask everybody to turn off your cameras and mute your microphones unless you are speaking. I also want to inform you that we will be recording the event, and we will share the recording and the resources and some additional resources after the event. You're very welcome to use the chat for comments throughout the side event, but we will only monitor it during the questions and answers session. And as a final note, I also want to mention that we have access to interpretation to French. Please follow the instructions on the slide that you see right now, or the instructions that you have in the chat, and you can also do some translations on that. With those few welcoming points, housekeeping points, and also in light of the very restricted time we have, I think we'll just get started. And on our part from the Danish Institute for Human Rights, I'm very pleased to deliver a few opening remarks just to set the scene for what we're going to talk about today. So, with the Sustainable Recovery Pledge that we launched in 2021, 48 state signatories and 28 supporting organizations recognized the devastating impact that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on our economies and societies, and the negative impacts on the enjoyment of human rights and progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The purpose of the pledge was to express determination to build back better from the pandemic, placing human rights at the heart of response and recovery efforts, and using the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement as a blueprint. The pledge, as you know, consists of 10 action points and a commitment to report on progress and renew the social contract, such as universal health coverage and vaccine equity, participatory governance practices, and service delivery mechanisms that reduce inequality, and the urgent need for a green transition to halt runaway climate change. By signing the Sustainable Recovery Pledge, member states and other stakeholders promise to undertake work on risk-informed strategies based on the belief that preparedness, response, and recovery strategies that respect human rights, and I'd like to emphasize that, will result in better and more just and sustainable outcomes. One of the points of the pledge that the Danish Institute for Human Rights made was that we will collect good practices from states that could be linked to the pledge and its implementation. And therefore, last week, we released the report, Sustainable Recovery Pledge, Good Practices for Change, and we will be sharing the link to this report in the chat. The hope of this report is twofold. So firstly, to share a collection of practices that could inspire peer learning and also spark discussions and strategies and ideas for recovery efforts that are human rights based and that contribute to achieving the SDG goals and targets. And to link these discussions with the broader contemporary global processes under which states seek to act collectively to build resilience and crisis preparedness grounded in human rights. And so today, the intention is to discuss the good practices of recovery and resilience building, and we will also explore the importance of integrating human rights into the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, as well as overcoming the impact of the multiple crises that we are facing. So basically, that should set out the agenda for today and frame the discussion. And before we dive into it, we are very welcome to have with us two distinguished speakers that will provide us with welcoming remarks. First of all, I'm very pleased to pass the floor to the permanent representative of Denmark to the United Nations in Geneva, Ambassador Erik Brygger Rasmussen, and after that we will hear the welcoming remarks by the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mrs. Nada El-Sharif. So Erik, it's a pleasure to have you with us. You, if any, combines the efforts to combat COVID in your country and now zoom in on the sustainable recovery, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mette, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this occasion. It's good to see you in that capacity as well. And for those who doesn't know, Mette and I used to be colleagues for many, many years in the ministry. I know that we have listeners all over the world, so there is both a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening irrespective of where you sit. And I would like to warmly welcome you all to this event. It takes place on the occasion of the 5th Intersessional meeting of the Human Rights Council on Human Rights and the 2030 Agenda. Some of you will probably join that later today. As Mette said, back in 2021, in conjunction with the 47th session of the Human Rights Council, Denmark, together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Universal Rights Group, launched this Sustainable Recovery Pledge. And as Mette also said, 48 states have signed on to the pledge, being supported by 28 organizations. The pledge encompasses 10 concrete commitments that seek to address some of the key issues highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know that for many of us, COVID-19 seems to be far away, but the effects of it is definitely still very much with us. And some of the issues highlighted in the pledge is universal health coverage and vaccine equity, participatory governance practices, and service delivery mechanisms that reduce inequality. And then the urgent need for a green transition to halt the runaway climate change, as well as risk reduction and disaster management and risk-informed and sustainable financing. So it's quite a broad agenda the pledge is trying to cover. This event is an excellent opportunity to continue the discussions we've had since 2021, both in New York and here in Geneva, on the key aspects of the pledge, which is the importance of ensuring that human rights and sustainable development are at the core of all recovery strategies. You cannot just walk one of those two. It has to be linked. That's the whole idea behind the pledge. Today, we will be building up on the discussion started at the high-level political forum back in 2022 on how to use lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic to build resilience and preparedness for future shocks in a way that puts the universal human rights of each individual at the heart of our efforts. Before ending, I wish to thank the Danish Institute for Human Rights Group for their work on this event, and also a special thanks to the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights for agreeing to giving opening remarks. And then I hope that everyone will have a fruitful discussion, and also that you will have some takeaways that you can use in your further endeavors. The effects, as I said, of the COVID-19 pandemic are still with us, so there are definitely still a lot to be done in terms of having a good recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Erik. And thank you for your strong message on putting human rights at the core of all recovery efforts. We now turn to our next introductory speaker, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mrs. Nada Al-Sharif. And I think that there is no need for a lengthy introduction of you, Deputy High Commissioner, as such a strong voice for human rights in general, and also for your focus on how to create positive change in the lived lives of people. So thank you very much for being with us, and Deputy High Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Mette. Thanks, Ambassador. And I'm delighted to join this discussion and share some thoughts on how human rights can always be part of the solution, certainly to help us withstand the multiple crises that threaten achievements towards a more just and sustainable future. And let me start really by thanking the Permanent Mission of Denmark and the Danish Institute for Human Rights for organizing this important event. Clearly, we are at a critical juncture. The latest SDG progress report issued by the UN Secretary General notes that the pandemic has erased over 4 years of progress on poverty eradication and pushed an additional 93 million people into extreme poverty. We were not really on target to achieve the SDGs, but less so now. The climate emergency and the wide-ranging and multifaceted impacts of conflict, not just the war in Ukraine, but clearly that, have further derailed our progress. We have witnessed a Human Development Index decline for 2 successive years for the first time in over 3 decades, reversing progress that we had hoped would be attainable. Today's challenges have highlighted and exacerbated inequalities, disproportionately affecting the most marginalized, pushing people behind rather than lifting them up. More and more people are having to choose between going hungry or going cold, between buying medicine or buying school books, being torn between falling prey to unsustainable debt to pay the rent or not having a roof over their heads. Global recession and austerity measures are expected in over 140 countries worldwide to contribute to enhancing poverty and deepening inequalities, both within but also between countries. 60% of low-income countries and 30% of emerging market economies are in or near debt distress. And this, of course, hampers the ability of states to deliver on those critical elements: health, education, social protection, and other human rights. Clearly, it is a formidable challenge, and the SDG summit next September, marking the halfway point to 2030, will be a critical moment to deliver a global plan to accelerate implementation, very much anchored in human rights outcomes, as we have already heard. And so we need a reset that places human rights at the center across all sectors, all policies, all dimensions of sustainable development. This is, in fact, the core of the Secretary General's vision behind the call to action for human rights and also our common agenda. And I'd like to put forward 3 points to, I think, stimulate the discussion and take away. If we aim to push the SDG wheel forward, then we must rotate the financial cog of that wheel in the same direction by taking concrete steps towards what we are calling a human rights enhancing economy, an approach on which we have worked rather extensively. First of all, we need to integrate existing human rights obligations into economic policy discussions in order to build an economy that truly benefits everyone, as per the objectives of the SDGs. States must be intentional in designing public budgets and revenue strategies that invest in economic, social, and other rights, that combat discrimination, reducing gender and other inequalities. This approach would be coherent with the pledge to leave no one behind and allow us to reach those furthest behind first. It is only with greater international solidarity that supports national efforts that we can collectively achieve the SDGs. Second, we need to do more and we need to do better on climate justice by actively supporting the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Anchoring environmental action in a human rights perspective has the potential to increase climate resilience, strengthen crisis preparedness and contingency planning in ways that benefit those who have contributed the least but are being impacted the most by the ongoing triple planetary crisis. And third, all policymaking should be grounded in meaningful participation. And I mean social dialogue, transparently and with accountability. States would greatly benefit from the broadest possible consultations through a protected and dynamic civic space. This lies at the core of SDG 16, which is essential to unlocking all of Agenda 2030. This is a moment for transformative leadership to build those more equal and sustainable societies that we all aspire to. And I hope we can work towards placing human rights at the center of policymaking, building on the vision of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Our campaign regarding the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, about just under a year away now, provides us with an opportunity for unity and hope as we mobilize the world for the cause of human rights, setting us on a path towards a better future based on justice and equality and dignity for all. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Nada, Deputy High Commissioner. Thank you so much for highlighting these 3 clear concepts, both of the human rights enhancing economy and emphasizing the climate justice and not least the meaningful participation agenda. So really thank you for those encouraging words and lots of inspiration. And I think now is the time then to turn to today's panel discussion. Before we do that, I would like to introduce our 4 panelists. First of all, we have with us the ambassador from Finland, Mrs. Kirsti Kauppi. We have the Deputy Director for the UNDP Crisis Bureau, Mr. George Conway. We have the Deputy Director for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the Malawi Human Rights Commission, Mr. Lucius Pendame. And we have Andre Rivas, President of AFDA, Familias Diversas Civil Association, on behalf of LGBTI stakeholder group. So welcome to you all. Now, I would like to first ask you, Ambassador Kauppi, as we have seen in the report that we are launching today, Finland has adopted a gender perspective from the very early stages of COVID-19 response and recovery, focusing on grassroots, national, and global levels. In your development cooperation, Finland is advocating for the participation of women in planning health systems and making sure that sexual and reproductive health and rights are part of a rights-based recovery. Perhaps I could ask you if you have experienced any challenges with the application of this approach, and perhaps share what your lessons learned are so far. So thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much to my dear colleagues at the Danish Mission and to the Danish Institute for Human Rights and Universal Rights Group for organizing this, for your leadership in this issue, very important issue. And also very much thank you, and I would like to congratulate for your focusing on lessons learned. It's very important. I would also like to really thank Deputy High Commissioner Dear Nada for your points, very important points, and certainly they provide for a good backbone for further discussions also in different arenas. As far as the Finnish approach is concerned, we have a human rights-based approach to many issues, I would say almost any issue of social development, and both nationally but also globally, and also very much related to recovery from the pandemic, but also other crises, and also the human rights-based approach as regarding preparedness. I think the big question is really very often, how do you do it? And I would say that there are two important starting points. The first is that you need to analyze the impact of the different crises through a human rights lens. That's very important. And I think we are still lagging behind in that respect, that we don't have enough of data, enough of granular data about the actual impact of both the pandemic, but also other crises that we either have experienced or that we have to prepare for. So the impact aspect is very important. The other aspect is solutions. And there, of course, we come to the question of participation and inclusion. So I think these are sort of the two approaches to how do you actually apply a human rights-based approach. Now, as far as your question is concerned, for us, analyzing especially the pandemic, it means that there has to be much more focus in general on economic, social, and cultural rights, more focus on non-discrimination as the approach, more focus on inclusion, and democracy and gender equality. For as far as we are concerned, it is very clear that the pandemic has tested the rule of law and democracy in Finland, but also internationally. Those countries that have proven most successful in fighting the pandemic are those where public trust in authorities is high. And for us, it has meant that we have to have a human rights-based, gender transformative and intersectional approach, which pays attention to those in most vulnerable situations, including persons with disabilities. And through this approach, you also have to address the root causes of discrimination, and that is very important. You have to hear the voices of those who are most affected. As far as the democratic processes are concerned, we have launched an interesting project together with the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, to develop new ways for participatory decision making so that everybody can participate and influence actually the decisions. So this is something very important, and there, of course, we come very easily to the question: how do you make sure that women and also other gender minorities are included? I also wanted to mention briefly the deepening learning crisis, which is obvious in many countries, and here I'd just like to emphasize the need for more data, because this is lacking still very much. Now, women and girls, that's your actual question, and I think the pandemic has really underlined the importance of universal health coverage, and which can only become reality if you have strong and resilient health systems, which include sexual and reproductive health services as part of the comprehensive primary health care. We are supporting in our development cooperation primary health care through funding sexual and reproductive health services. These are actually, if you look at primary healthcare sector, these are the most underfunded services in many countries and globally. So this is something that we are doing. Also, the data acquired during the pandemic has shown that the needs of young persons and adolescents are not being met in terms of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So youth-friendly sexual and reproductive health services are key, and we are very much stressing the participation of women and youth in planning health systems. We are, through Finnish support, partners have delivered comprehensive sexuality education to some 92 million adolescent and young people all over the world. So our commitment towards gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights is very much based on principle, but also very much practical understanding and data about how much these are key to realizing overall human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights for girls and women. So this is maybe what I would like to emphasize, the importance of these services. Our experience in our own country testifies to how much these rights, the implementation of these rights, means for overall development, sustainable development, but also the realization of human rights at large. Thank you.
No, thank you so much to you, Ambassador, and thank you for sharing your lessons and the lessons you have learned, and I think also for the strong call for more granular data. This is incredibly important, and we hear your call in this connection. I think perhaps we should move to the next speaker in the panel. Before we get back to you, Ambassador, I would like to welcome Mr. George Conway, the Deputy Director for the UNDP Crisis Bureau. It's a real pleasure to have you with us, George. Thank you for joining. And I think on the basis of the intervention just made by the Ambassador, perhaps I could ask you to speak on the importance of a human rights-based approach when you work on resilience building and recovery from the crisis. I think there's no doubt that the UNDP has played a key role in the sustainable recovery process in many countries. And perhaps just hearing from you how you highlight the importance of the human rights-based approach in this connection could be add a lot of value to the discussion. So thank you, George. I'll just pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, and good day, colleagues. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to participate in this discussion today. You know, given the multiple intersecting crises that we're experiencing and that are impacting on the future development, including the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, narrowing fiscal space, the debt crisis, increased cost of living, demographic challenges, social upheaval, political polarization and the erosion of the rule of law and human rights protection, we are facing a really challenged landscape these days. And at the same time, these crises are becoming far more protracted and cyclical. And the causes are multidimensional, often rooted in development deficits and, in fact, in the deprivation of access to rights. And the required integrated development solutions are needed to address the structural underlying causes. So strong measures are needed today and moving forward to address structural drivers of exclusion, inequality, discrimination, whether these are found in laws, in the way that institutions function, or in overt policies, programs, as well as attitudes and practices. Progress towards the 2030 Agenda is facing severe disruption today. As the Deputy High Commissioner mentioned, UNDP's Human Development Report has recently demonstrated the most significant multi-year backsliding on human development since we started tracking the Human Development Index over 30 years ago. And in the face of this significant disruption, we have an obligation to continue to and more robustly integrate human rights concerns into the pursuit of the 2030 Agenda and in our collective efforts to resume progress towards the SDGs and help overcome the impact of the multiple crises that we're currently facing. And so for UNDP, a people-centered approach and a human rights-based approach is essential throughout our engagement across crisis cycles and drives our work both in anticipating, preventing, responding, and recovering to crisis. And we've recently issued a new crisis offer that outlines how it is that we're trying to do this. Strengthening governance foundations for effective social contracts, deepening human security, and ultimately building more resilient and stable societies that leave no one behind are really core aspects of this approach. Our response systems critically need not only to support people with humanitarian assistance to survive throughout the happening of crisis, but also to help them to do so in dignity and with full respect for their fundamental human rights. And this is why we in UNDP do focus on investing in people's agency and choice and opportunity through what can be the hardest times of their lives. So in our response and recovery efforts, as well as in our work to anticipate and build resilience to crisis, we support countries to support more efficient and effective governance systems, strengthening justice, human rights, and security in ways that are more equitable, accountable, and effective in terms of service delivery, and to empower rights holders to claim rights in protected and inclusive civic spaces. And in the process of building back better lives after crisis, it's crucial that we empower women, youth, to promote inclusive institutions, including for the rule of law and respect for human rights, and strengthen social cohesion for more peaceful, just, and sustainable human development. In this respect, we were proud to have co-authored with the UN Human Rights Office the checklist for human rights-based approaches to social economic country responses to COVID-19 as one particular tool, for example, to support the UN's country operations to ensure a more robust focus on those most at risk of being left behind, to integrate international human rights norms and standards into our responses. And this was used extensively by UN country teams on the ground in the preparation and delivery of their social economic response plans to COVID-19. So maybe I'll leave my comments here for now, but I do look forward to the further discussion and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George, for your contribution on this. I really appreciate, we really appreciate the focus that you have on the rebuilding of the social contract and how to work on agency and choice at the very concrete level in your country operations. So thank you for that contribution, and I think it links very well with our next panelist, Lucius Pandame from the Malawi Human Rights Commission. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, Lucius, and I'm hesitating a bit because I can't see you on the screen, but I know we spoke just a moment ago, so if excellent. Lucius, it's great to see you, and thanks for being with us, and please, I'll just pass the floor to you on this.
Thank you very much. Distinguished guests on this discussion. Here I am. My name is Lucius Pandame. I work as Deputy Director for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in the Malawi Human Rights Commission. Regarding the subject under discussion, in Malawi, we conducted a research that was essentially supported by Danish Institute for Human Rights that's both technically and financially, and also Network of African National Human Rights Institutions, NANRI, which is our regional network in Africa. Also, they supported us, I think, technically on the research. The research was primarily focusing on the social protection program, which we chose in Malawi from a series of the programs that we have. So we chose AIP, which essentially means Affordable Impulse Program, which is a program that supports local farmers in trying to improve on their yield each and every year of production. But we also investigated the effects of COVID-19 on such programming, and we target people in the category of persons with disabilities as our focus group. In terms of objectives of this research, we wanted to investigate the extent to which social protection program in Malawi adhere to human rights principles in the protection and promotion of the rights to social protection programs in Malawi, with a focus on persons with disabilities. The AIP was, as I said, chosen amongst several other programs that we have in Malawi. So the key findings of the research was that Malawi is found to have no specific pieces of legislation on social protection, and also AIP, which is the program that we try to follow, did not adequately comply human rights-based approach in its programming. For your information, we targeted this program for 2021, 2022, just to ensure that the information was not lost, that we could have examined. The third key finding was that the COVID-19 pandemic worsened this group of people accessibility to AIP. There were so many factors that were discovered having impacted upon by COVID-19 and worsening the situation of the persons with disabilities accessibility to AIP itself. Coming to the questions that you asked us to clarify, we were requested to come up with an outcome, a key outcome that we think could showcase the critical importance of social protection to resilience from our program. So the outcome that we got is that the AIP was implemented without complying with the human rights-based approach. And this has been, I think, a question that we would want to address in the future as regards such kind of a program, if it is to benefit persons with disabilities and also all the vulnerable populations that look upon the AIP for assistance. Just to extend from there, one critical importance of social protection program to resilience, we found that is that the social protection programs do act as safety nets for marginalized groups of people, like the persons with disabilities. But also we found that this can only be achieved if human rights-based approach in the design, implementation, and monitoring of these programs can embrace a human rights-based approach per se, so that persons with disabilities or any other marginalized category of people are taken on board. Their views are incorporated in the programming. We were also asked to highlight some lessons that we would think other countries can get from our study. In a nutshell, we are saying that the governments should adopt a synergy approach in implementing social protection programs, like social programming should have needs-based approach, and the vulnerable must be involved in the design and all the processes of the programming up to the end when we do evaluation and monitoring and evaluation of those programs. In other ways, the government should, much as the programs are, I think, championed by policy holders or ministries that are directly involved, but also there are other organizations, there are other departments, like the social welfare departments, which we found in this study that they were sidelined, they were not taking part in crucial decisions regarding how the project would benefit persons with disabilities. So we are saying that in the future, governments should adopt a synergy. There has to be synergy working together with the other departments of similar interest to the persons that we are targeting to benefit such kind of programs. We also saying that government should incorporate the human rights standards in programming of social protection programs, because in our finding we found that it was very ultimate that the programming in its entirety lacked in the embracing of human rights standards and the human rights based approach as a tool was, I think, not compliant with, and therefore all these problems with this particular kind of a program. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Lucius, for sharing the research that you did on social protection for the marginalized groups in Malawi and this particular focus on disabilities. And I clearly hear you saying that the pandemic did worsen their situation, and yes, the safety net did improve, the social protection did improve their life, but it had been working with a human rights-based approach to ensure equal treatment and a greater involvement could have made a big difference. It's an important learning that we're very pleased to have taken with us here. And I think building on that, perhaps we should now introduce our fourth panelist, Andre Rivas. Andre, if I may ask you the question that we know that LGBTI people have also been disproportionately affected by the pandemic in multiple ways. And this crisis has, to a large extent, exacerbated the many already existing inequalities that we know. How, in your organization, have you ensured or looked at the specific needs and challenges in crisis and recovery that are faced by LGBTI communities, and how do you work on ensuring and identifying and including these in recovery strategies going forward? Thanks a lot, and we're looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. It's a pleasure and an honor for me. Well, in our case in Argentina, I think that a good practice that address the needs of especially the trans and non-binary population in Argentina was that we, as a movement, successfully called for a structural recovery measure, which is the trans and non-binary labor quota. First, the government put out an executive decree, and then we passed a law. And this labor quota means that there is positions that are guaranteed in the public state, in the national public state sector, in a proportion none less than 1% of the total positions of the states. I think that this is a measure that is not only a recovery measure, also addresses a structural cause of discrimination and also exclusion of our community. But I think that in the lessons learned that we have learned from the COVID crisis, I think that the main step to work with us, with the LGBTI community, and to really advance in our rights, it is very important to ensure that the LGBTI plus community, civil society, participates institutionally in the design of public policies at a high-level political forums and in decision-making processes. And this means to put the LGBTI plus community in the driven seat of public policies that affect us. Also creating international and UN opportunities that are inclusive, but also safe for LGBTI plus persons, especially when it comes to people from places where LGBTI plus people are criminalized, and also unsafe. Another important measure is to transversalize public policies with an LGBTI plus perspective. Also, as Deputy High Commissioner Nada mentioned, the importance of the budget, the public budget of the states. And I think that is very important in this budget to have a gender and also LGBTI plus perspective, and also increase the funding that is going to strengthen the LGBTI plus community in all stages of life, from childhood to adulthood. For example, with special programs for accessing housing, improvement on sexual comprehensive education, with an LGBTI plus perspective, strengthening the diverse families, special programs for the diverse families, and also employment programs. Just these are a few examples. And also the Ambassador Christie mentioned the importance of data, because the lacking of data is how the different states are not addressing the structural exclusion and marginalization of our community, because we need to be shown in the data state. So that is very important, that the states work on produce data and to be very careful with that data. Not only to get that data, but also to manage with very safety procedures of that data. And of course, it is important to increase the donor support directly to the LGBTI plus community and civil society, because we are advocating, and for doing that, we need to do it more effectively, and we need all the support for doing that, because, as I said previously, we need to be in the driven seat of the public policies that affect us. So I think that this is a executive summarize of what I think that we learned from the COVID in this moment, and I hope that the states are changing. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Andre, and also in sharing your hope that things will be changing. And I think we also note your call for inclusion of concerns in the public budgets, and your call to the donors, and not least sharing the call for better data, and for using data, and for protecting data. I think that's a very strong message here. And if we now zoom in on the sustainable recovery process, which is the next round of questions that we have for our panelists, I just want to take the opportunity to invite our audience to make comments, and also to be aware that we are now opening up for questions in the chat. And please just put your questions in the chat, and we will be taking note of them, and then we'll try to direct as many of them to the panelists as we can. So the chat is now open for questions and comments, and please don't hesitate to put them there. So getting back to the panel and the sustainable recovery, I think perhaps I could get back to you first, Ambassador Kauppi. We were listening very much to your lessons learned so far, but could we also ask you to get back to the results that you have seen and to comment and perhaps elaborate on the added value that you have taken from them? Ambassador Kauppi, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. It took a while before I got the camera on, but thank you very much. And you know, the answer to this added value, I think, is very simple and sort of common sense answer, but in the sense that we always get better results if we have an inclusive approach and think about the whole range of human rights. But I wanted to maybe focus a little bit on what I said about women's and girls' rights, and also the sexual and reproductive health and rights issue again, because this is often seen as something a little bit through ideological lens. And I already mentioned and tried to emphasize the fact that our own experience is that even if you leave aside sort of the principle of it, our experience is that this is a very concrete thing. It's, for instance, if we think about the COVID situation and the fact that it had a big impact on everything, and we, of course, would like to recover as fast as possible, which means that we would want to minimize the long-term impact. And when you think about the long-term impact, one of the key issues is the participation of girls in education, or the participation of women in education and economic activities, and the aspect of social services. So then you very quickly come to this issue that how do you minimize these long-term impacts? And the best way to minimize them is to ensure that girls continue to have access to education. And then you very quickly come to issues such as sexual and reproductive health and rights. This is a global thing, but it's also very much our own in Finland, historically speaking, a very concrete conclusion. So maybe this is one thing that I want to emphasize as far as value added. It's about also the long-term impact and minimizing the negative long-term consequences of the pandemic, but this applies to any crisis. The other sort of value added is related to more broadly the inclusive approach, and there I really want to agree with everything that has been said about two sort of groups that are usually ignored, or their importance is not seen. They are considered to be marginal group, but are certainly not marginal when we are thinking about the impact of different kinds of crises regarding also the pandemic. And these are the sexual minorities, but also persons with disabilities. And this has struck me and us in Finland also, that unless you take a human rights-based approach and, in other words, emphasize the need to look at minorities and their rights, non-discrimination and inclusion, the impact of different crises on these key populations is very easily ignored because they are considered as marginal groups. And that is again when we come to the question of, well, if you ignore these two groups and their rights, and that has a big long-term impact on sustainability and sustainable development goals. So maybe these are sort of just some reflections on the value added for the whole society on as far as human rights-based approach is concerned, but also focusing on women and girls and focusing on minority groups. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, and also for focusing in on the long-term impact on the pandemic on the rights of women and girls and minorities, and not least the right to education, including when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights. I think that element also links up very well with your first point and the point made by several speakers on data. And perhaps at this point I could turn back to you, George, and ask you, based on your experiences in the UNDP, how can data collection and analysis be used for building resilience and preparedness for future crises? So please, George, we're looking forward to your perspective on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's an important question, and grounding our collective work in evidence and data, given the multidimensional and intersecting nature of crises, has clearly taken on a really increased prominence in our collective work. Data collection and analysis are essential for analyzing and anticipating risks and for providing the types of decision intelligence necessary to best inform our development priorities and investments. On the one hand, data aggregation can help to inform faster and more effective decision-making on anticipatory and preventative actions and programming to address crisis risks and trends as we see them on the horizon. Whether it's hotspot mapping, trends in violent incidents, hate speech, human rights issues, protests, as well as natural hazards, whether they're climatic or geophysical, biological and epidemic risks. Our ability to track these does support decision-making processes on both policy as well as program priorities and solutions. Similarly, data disaggregation is absolutely necessary to withstand the differential impacts and how different challenges and crises affect different populations and groups, and to understand the intersectional dimensions of structural discrimination that hold back progress and hinder solutions. And in fact, in the absence of which we can further create exclusion, marginalization, and vulnerability to risks. So ensuring a more robust use of data and analytics in our work is absolutely necessary, especially as part of our support to national and local capacity building for resilience and preparedness to help our program countries and partners get ahead of crisis curves. UNDP's work on human rights specifically is country focused, and we're working in more than 50 countries in partnership with national human rights institutions. These bodies have a critical role in analysis of human rights, whether it's receiving and processing complaints of different types of human rights violations, or acting as a bridge to populations who are often being left behind or at risk of such. And the role of these institutions can be critical to help bring the analysis of data into the discussion on solutions, and in doing so, prioritizing those who are left behind. So our partnerships with national human rights instruments and civil society really do help drive the quality of understanding of the context in which we're working in, especially at very local levels, and the appropriateness of our collective solutions to be delivered. Another important source of data that we have, as well as a source of insights, are the recommendations and outputs from human rights mechanisms, whether they're treaty bodies, special procedures, and the Universal Periodic Review process. And the analysis and recommendations from these mechanisms do provide us with clear guideposts, increasingly practical advice and recommendations, particularly in relationship to how to support disadvantaged or marginalized groups, and how to make policy more inclusive in a number of areas. UNDP, we also support what we call crisis risk dashboards, CRDs, at the global level and in 41 countries and regional hubs, which provides both support to UNDP country offices and UN country teams in our support to national, local governments and other stakeholders to better understand and act upon trends and signals. We also have a gender and crisis facility through which we seek to prioritize gender data in the analysis of risk and crisis. And these types of efforts from our side really do help us as early as possible to collect data and provide early assessments of the differentiated social economic impacts of a crisis, and to mobilize better targeted development support in parallel with, in addition to humanitarian responses, again, to support the agency and choice of those at risk of being most left behind. We have a number of country examples we could speak to here. In Kenya, we supported a holistic approach to electoral support, which included a strong component on data collection and monitoring in order to inform early warning and to reduce the risk of electoral violence, and to target support for dialogue processes. In Lebanon, we have a tension monitoring system that's been established to collect data, analyze, and provide feedback and recommendations on addressing community tensions and better targeting our work on social cohesion, and a number of other country-level cases that I'd be happy to speak to. But I'll leave my comments there for now. So with great thanks and looking forward to the forward conversation.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot, George, and thank you for highlighting the need, and I think you put it very nicely, the need for both the data aggregation and disaggregation at the same time. These are very strong needs that several speakers share, and also to highlight really the intersectional dimensions of the discrimination as such. And I think the idea of your crisis boards and how you use them to act on trends and tendencies are very useful, and also with the concrete country examples. And this, and on that note, I think I will turn to Mr. Pendame. Lucius, you highlighted the social protection of vulnerable groups, and I'd like to ask you at this point what you think is needed to ensure that the right to social protection is inclusive in the most vulnerable, inclusive of the most vulnerable in a sustainable ways, and maybe how you would identify the specific needs of these groups in Malawi. So Lucius, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for passing on to me again. Regarding the first, I think the first question, we are thinking that for states like ours to progress in this particular area, there's a need to have laws and policies enacted which are inclusive, and also these policies and laws must speak to each other. There has to be, they need to go and address, they need to be formulated, enacted to address one common problem. So the programming should be informed by these laws. And most importantly, they must be inclusive. In here, those people who are affected greatly by the pandemics or by the laws have to take part in coming up with contributions towards the enactment or indeed formulation of those policies and laws. In the designing and implementation of activities themselves or the programs themselves, we are also saying that the vulnerable people or the marginalized people should form part and parcel of the teams, so that they speak within from within, and their voices at that particular time will be guaranteed to be considered. We are also saying that participation in general at different levels of decision making is very vital to include or to consider such categories of people, of persons, to be part of. So social protection programming, which is inclusive and participatory, we feel that will ensure that the marginalized groups meaningfully participate while guaranteeing sustainability of those programming. We're also saying that laws and policies which govern social protection have to be should be tailored towards ensuring that to facilitate the realization of the needs of the marginalized. These people have got their own needs, which cannot be easily identified by those people who are working without them. So by including them into the system, into the programming, we are sure that that kind of approach will facilitate the realization of their needs. And therefore, if a state or if a country have got some laws which are partially recognizing the vulnerable people, we are saying that there's a need for those laws to be reviewed. Let us go into a review of such laws, improve them to make sure that they are addressing the core issues that are affecting the vulnerable and the marginalized groups. Then you are also asking how would we identify the needs of the marginalized. So we are saying that looking at all this work, we feel that consultations is key. Consulting those who have got the problem, those in the category that we would want to address their challenges, is very key to gathering more and effective needs, so that once we address those needs, these people are assured of enjoying their rights. So wider consultations and ensuring that there's inclusivity in the programming, we feel that would promote the principle of nothing for us without us. We have this principle which we know all over the world, that it's important to include those people whom we are trying to address, whose challenges we are trying to address. So in this case, we are trying to address challenges that that the marginalized people are facing. In our research, we are dealing with persons with disabilities. So in a nutshell, we need to include those, we need to take them on board so that they can speak their issues within, and also in doing that, they can help us to identify their needs, very simply. So specific needs of marginalized groups on specific social protection programs can be identified through consultations with themselves or affiliated groups, or sometimes we can do needs assessment, survey. We can take we can also read a lot of literature where the marginalized people have written about themselves, and then from there we can take such kind of information and try to implement into a programming like a social protection program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucius, for making these very concrete suggestions for how to work on inclusion of vulnerable people. And I think you highlighted a number of important avenues to do that. And I just wanted to highlight your suggestion that always for laws and policies to be inclusive, perhaps it is necessary that vulnerable people are part of the social protection programming teams when you're working and preparing on this. So thanks a lot for these ideas and suggestions. I can see we have a very lively chat, so we're getting back to that. But before I do that, I think, Andre, I'd be really keen to ask you also if you are aware of any mechanisms or recovery measures that address the specific needs and challenges that are faced by the LGBTI plus persons that you identified.
Yes. As I mentioned before, I think that one of the better mechanisms and recovery measures that was sanctioned and enacted in Argentina was the trans and non-binary labor quota. Yes, that I mentioned before. And I think that I want to highlight that this recovery measure, it is a recovery measure, but also a sustainable measure, because what is addressing is a structural cause of marginalization, because now trans and non-binary population could access a labor quota in the public sector of Argentina and have the access to work guarantee. And how we achieve this? Well, it was achieved with the participation of the civil society, the LGBTI plus civil society. And I want to stress, as many of the panelists did before, especially the ambassador Christy, about the participation of the different groups. It is very important that the LGBTI plus community, the LGBTI plus advocates and civil society participates in the design of the public policies. Because if we are not there in the decision making, in the design stage of the public policies, the public policies have a high level of probability to fail. And we can see that, for example, in the in the case of the policies that are designed for youth, and for because, for example, here in my country, there's a helpline for youth in reproductive and health services, but it's a line, a phone line, and not here in Argentina, and I think in all of the world, I think that youth and adolescents and children are not using phones, are using cell phones and TikTok and another way of communicating. So they are not using that line, and the state put a lot of effort, and it is a great line, but all the children and the youth are in another place, communicating in another place. So I think that is something very simple that it could be solved with the participation of the youth and the girls, and also LGBTI plus girls and children. So that's an example to how to improve the public policies. And now we are working, getting back again to the LGBTI public policies in recovery measures. Now we are aiming to have on a national level reparation, an economic reparation to the elder trans population, because we see it as a need to that the state need to reparate all the human rights violations that they face, because there's a lot of I forgot the name in English, but when you design your life project, there's a lot of life projects that were diminished, and there's a lot of marginalization in the elder population. So we are aiming that the state at a national level recognize a reparation, economic reparation, not a pension, a reparation for the trans and non-binary population. So I leave my comments here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Andre, for sharing those concrete examples, both of the positive initiatives that can be taken, and also on the clear demonstrations on how non-inclusive policies will work in designing helplines on the phone for young people. So thank you for that. On this note, I will hurry up and pass the floor to my colleague, Mika, who will take us through a few questions in the Q&A. And I do apologize, Mika, we don't have time for many questions, but I'm convinced, and I trust that you have highlighted a few that we can pass on to our panelists. Mika, please.
Thanks so much, Meta, and thanks for the speakers. I was taking notes as you were speaking, and also the chat was very lively. So I noted all the questions. As always in those events, we cannot go through all of them, but I will try to group them to satisfy as many of you as possible. So you know, one of the things that came very clearly in the discussion was participation, and especially specifically meaningful participation of marginalized groups to make, you know, to be able to participate in decisions on policy that impact their lives. So one of the questions that came out in the chat was partially common, that participation requires time and skills as well as resources, and crisis at the same time typically requires, you know, very short-term immediate responses. So how do we manage the balance between immediate decision-making needs and then on the other side the needs for longer-term engagement and dialogue to understand the potential human rights impacts of those interventions? So what are your reflections on this, the balance between immediate and long-term actions? And the floor is yours to the speakers.
Perhaps, Mika, we can start by asking Ambassador Kirsti to go in.
Of course.
Thank you very much. And very briefly, because I think basically the solution has already been given in the previous interventions, and it is that you have to build those relationships already in advance. They have to be part of the regular decision-making processes, like preparation of laws and so on and so forth. And there, I think at least two elements were already mentioned. One is the participation of civil society in these different regular decision-making processes or legal processes. And that is very important. So it means that, of course, it's important that the civil society exists and that it is sort of, there's a regular communication between decision-making makers and civil society organizations. So that's one point. I think the social media is the other dimension. It's a new dimension, but it cannot be ignored. And again, it is part of already the regular decision-making process. I think we all know that the decision makers follow the social media, and it is in many organizations already sort of, again, part of following the implementation of different decisions. So it's already there, but in crisis situations, what becomes very important is that it's kept in mind how do you make sure that the social media participation is sort of equal. And that was, of course, a very key question in the pandemic situation, because suddenly how would you make certain that, for instance, persons with hearing impairments or visual impairments can access the information and can feed into the information flow, which again went very much to not only the traditional media, but to the social media. And in our case in Finland, there was a very conscious effort in that crisis situation to focus on, especially on persons with disabilities, to make sure that they remain part of the, let's say, the mutual interaction and communication. And in that crisis situation, it remained critical. I would like to very much also underline what was already said about, since we are talking about social media, about the aging population. And I have to say that there we probably failed in Finland. We didn't make sure that we hear the aging population enough, because they were certainly impacted a lot by the restrictive measures. So again, one lesson learned to be learned there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And also thank you for also acknowledging the lessons learned and taking them forward, because I think that's also the point of going through a crisis, to seeing what worked very well and what we can take forward, but also what we could do better. So thanks for that comment as well. Does any other speaker has comments on this question? Then the floor is yours. Go ahead, please, George.
George from UNDP here. Yeah, no, thanks. I agree entirely with the ambassador's comments, and frankly, she took part of what I wanted to say in response to this. I mean, when we think about crisis nowadays, we really have to shift from response-oriented paradigms to a sustained engagement. And as a long-term development actor, UNDP is present on the ground and working with national stakeholders, counterparts, and civil society in advance of crisis to build resilience, to understand the complexities of local dynamics. When crisis does arise or hit, we do work with national level institutions and capacities on overall recovery planning, sustaining development engagements throughout crisis. But because of the pre-existing relationships that we have, including very local relationships, working through networks of civil society actors, we can develop a very nuanced understanding as to local complexities, and how very localized developments can fuel very specific marginalizations and exclusion that need to be understood and prioritized while we're doing our responses. So when, for example, we supported the social economic impact assessments of COVID-19, and the corresponding social economic recovery plans, we were able, in many cases, with some significant nuance, to understand how the pandemic was impacting differentially on different types of groups, and that did allow better targeting of the responses when the UN was galvanizing and marshalling its support. So it's a really important point, and the sort of macro and micro attention really needs to move hand in hand, and we're increasingly getting good systems in place to support that. Over.
Many thanks. Andre or Lucius, do you have any comments on this one?
Yes, sure, Mika. I think I wanted to comment on 3 things. One, in terms of short-term interventions to ensure that marginalized people, I think their issues are addressed. We are of the thinking that, like in our study, I think one of the problems that we also got was the national data that is available with our National Statistics Office does not show clearly the number of persons with disabilities who have been beneficiaries of on this particular program. So we were saying that it is important that I think we work on that one to ensure that the national data on social protection is actually disaggregated, and the issues of persons with disabilities should come out clear. And amongst those people with disabilities, also there should be further disaggregation. You know, there are so many disability forms amongst those people with persons with disabilities. So that is one area that we I think can be done. Secondly, because on such programming, there are people who are supposed to be beneficiaries have to be registered from the villages, from several towns. So we also discovered that there's a problem with the authorities that are responsible for registering these would be beneficiaries. So to curb that, or to address that, we think that it is important that we need to have awareness campaigns or awareness programs to make these structures aware that whenever they are registering people to such type of social protection programming, they have to consider persons with disabilities and other people with some other vulnerabilities into the program, regardless of the fact that maybe we don't have a concrete program, I mean a concrete policy or a concrete law. But I think as a starting point, we need to make these people aware of the need for the inclusion of these marginalized groups of people. But finally, as a long-term issue or long-term approach, we are saying that maybe there's a need for laws which would deliberately be enacted to resolve such kind of dilemmas, because we would push for awareness, we would push for inclusiveness, but if these are not backed up by legal framework and the policy frameworks, then these things will be temporary. So we are saying that as a long-term initiative, we need to advocate for enactment of appropriate laws and policies so that these things are progressive and also they are permanent in their execution. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lucius, and I really appreciate, your last, the whole reflection, but also specifically the last comment, emphasizing that it needs to be sustainable and permanent. to make sense and not exclude people in case of next crisis or in general. Andre.
Yes, I just want to reinforce that idea because I think that in the designing of public policies, the decision makers need to choose between if they want to give the LGBTI plus people relief and still talking about a marginalized group, or they are really designing policies to include us in equal terms, because I think that no LGBTI plus person wants to live in the position of being marginalized. And I think that that approach needs to change. It's not making policies to give relief or temporary solutions, social programming. I think that it is a part of the relief right now, but we need to push for furthermore to design public policies that includes and put in the same position as another person without a heteropatriarchal approach. We need really to look into that, and as Lucius says, we really need to design policies with a long-term impact, but starting right now. And if there's sometimes there's a biases in if we are skilled or not. And I think that if a policy is designed with a gender bias or with an LGBTI bias, it is going to fail. And we have a lot of examples. And we also have a lot of examples that when it's designed with the participation of the LGBTI plus society in equal terms, and with their opinion, that policy is successful in addressing the long-term solution. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. And basically, we are calling for system change and shift in norms. Thank you so much for this. I will give the floor back to Mere to take us to the closing of the session. Mere?
Thank you so much, Mika. And can I just say thank you also to our panelists for your time and for joining our side event. I think it works better when you see me too. My apologies for that. I just wanted to say thank you to Mika for this Q&A session, but particularly thank you to our panelists for your time and for joining our side event today. I'm very aware that we need to respect your busy agendas and to let you get back to your meeting, the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. So just to reiterate that when we committed to the Sustainable Recovery Pledge, we started a process of recovery, even as we still battled to get out of the grip of the pandemic. The signatories have done hard work to address the systemic injustices and to push for the required transformation of our societies and economies that still is required. States need to continue to take bold action to realize the 10 action points in the pledge and to deliver on human rights, on the 2030 agenda, and on the Paris Agreement commitments. Civil society plays a critical role in contributing to these solutions and to build democratic societies and holding governments accountable for their commitments. Human rights institutions such as my own and actors can inform strategies and help monitor sustainable recovery responses and recovery actions. The undersigned states have pledged to report on their progress in realizing the pledge, and we at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, we are collecting best practices report from the signatory states and will be publishing the results of the mapping in the next few months. It will be a collection of best practices and hopefully inspire you all to take us forward. On this note, I just want to say thank you for your time, and we will continue this together, and I wish you all the best for today. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.